Good evening, everyone. Before we get started, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Or if you want to type in the chat box, just let me know that my audio is coming through, and then we will get rocking and rolling. Perfect. Awesome. All right, we will get rocking and rolling, and then as more people kind of join in, they'll get caught up. So, welcome everybody tonight. My name is Dr. Perry Maynard, and tonight's topic is fatigue, but even more specifically, neurofatigue, or how might the brain be causing one's fatigue, right? As we'll talk about, fatigue can be very complex, right? And we know that it's such a common thing that so many people experience on a daily basis. And a lot of times there's not a lot of answers for it, right? Or traditional healthcare doesn't have a lot of answers for fatigue. So today I'm going to dive into a lot of different mechanisms behind fatigue, because that's going to be really the key, is identifying where the fatigue is coming from or what type of fatigue, so then we can have an intervention that is accurate and therapeutic for that individual. So a little bit more about me for those of you that I don't know. So like I said, I'm Dr. Perry Maynard, one of the doctors at Integrated Health Systems and Integrated Brain Centers in Inglewood, Colorado, just south of Denver. So I'm a board certified chiropractic neurologist with training in traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, training in vestibular rehab, and then also functional medicine and immunology, right? So in our clinic, we kind of combine all of those tools to help treat individuals with traumatic brain injuries, autoimmune conditions, dizziness, balance disorders. So we really try to integrate all of these different areas of healthcare into one clinic with different practitioners so that we can better serve our patients. So like I said, today we're going to talk about fatigue, right? We're going to get right into it, right? So we're going to talk about different types of fatigue, right? So if we're looking at the first thing, right, we're going to really categorize it into two different things: perception of fatigue, okay, and then performance fatigability. Okay, we're going to go back to here. So perception of fatigue, okay? So really, when you look at the research, one of the more difficult parts with fatigue is getting people to identify it, right? A lot of people will state, well, I have fatigue, but what does that really mean, right? It's a very vague statement. Is it body fatigue? Is it mental fatigue? Is it maybe memory issues? Is it motivation issues? Is it depression that makes you feel like you're fatigued, right? And this is what we're really going to take a look at. So the first thing in regards to perception of fatigue is homeostatic balance, right? This is where we're looking at the areas of the body, more specifically the brain or the hypothalamus, that have to do with regulating the body's energy, right? So the hypothalamus is a part of the brain that regulates blood sugar, it regulates body temperature, it regulates hormones, um, all sorts of functions that really you want to be in equilibrium, right? So I'll give you an example is, when people get sick, right, and you get a fever, that's your hypothalamus doing that, right? That's the infection in the immune system altering the way your hypothalamus is working, right? Things like chronic stress can affect this, all sorts of different things. An example of where you see this really go awry is in patients with migraines, right? And if you think about it, individuals with migraines, if they miss a meal, their migraine gets worse. Changes in barometric pressure, different times in a female cycle, right? Because all of these things affect the hypothalamus, right? So if the hypothalamus is off, this is going to alter energy systems in the body and can throw off hormones, all sorts of things, right? And so this could be one cause of an individual's fatigue. Examples of where this system can go awry are things like TBI, infections, Parkinson's disease, things like MS, and chronic stress, right? Now, it doesn't have to be just those things. There could be a variety of other things, but those are some very common things that can affect the hypothalamus and lead to fatigue. Okay. The second is psychological, right? And this is really where you're looking more at mood and motivation. Things like depression, or not feeling motivated or not getting rewards for doing things, right? So more of these kind of behavioral disorders, right? Where it's not necessarily alterations in your energy states within your body, but a perception of fatigue. And this is really, really important, right? Because these individuals may drink a bunch of coffee, take a bunch of stimulants, but nothing really makes a difference, right? Because it's more mood and motivation, or things like depression being masked as maybe fatigue, right? So it's really, really important that we tease these different things out, right? Same thing, you can see these in traumatic brain injuries, certain types of dementia or early cognitive decline, chronic fatigue syndrome, and then once again, Parkinson's disease as well. Okay. So then if we move to performance fatigability, okay, so we talked about two things that can cause perception of fatigue. Now let's look at performance fatigability. So really, like we said, we go back to this is fatigue. There's not many ways to test it besides maybe a subjective complaint, a questionnaire, versus performance fatigue, where we're actually measuring output from the body. So maybe it's cognitive testing and we're actually looking at fatigability in different networks of the brain. Maybe it's muscular testing, right? We're actually looking at endurance of these systems, right? So I really want to get that point across because I think that's very important in that sometimes fatigue can be perceptual. We feel it, but systems aren't actually fatiguing out. And then you can actually have performance fatigue where systems are a little bit wonky and they're actually fatiguing out or performance is declining with repeat testing. Okay. So peripheral factors. What this means, peripheral, I mean outside of kind of the brain, right? But are still part of the nervous system. So these are things like muscles, nerves, and energy stores, right? So these might be individuals who say, I just have like body fatigue. My legs feel weak. My arms feel weak. It feels like I had I have a soccer player, a collegiate soccer player this week, and he describes his symptoms as he gets done with 2 days every day, right? And he's just fatigued, body fatigue all the time. Okay. So this is loss of muscle force, maybe secondary to energy depletion. So maybe there's alterations in the energy systems within the muscle, maybe how they utilize sugars, proteins, fats, things like that. And then sometimes you can have certain muscular diseases or pathologies to nerves, or what's called the neuromuscular junction, which is the junction between a nerve and a muscle. There can be actual disease processes that can affect those that can lead to almost a sensation of body weakness. Okay. And we're going to get into each of these a little bit more in detail. And then we have central factors, right? So these are looking at cortical and subcortical networks. So now we're actually looking at maybe cognitive testing or an individual who's doing schoolwork, and by the end of the schoolwork, they are just fatigued out, right? So as they're using their brain, as they're using their attention, it's fatiguing out these actual networks, right? So now we're looking at actual dysfunction in these executive areas of the brain. So it looks like I have one person that says they lost me. Is that in regards to sound? Can everyone still hear me? If everyone can still hear me, give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Looks like people can. Okay, so I'm going to continue on. Oh, let me come here. Perfect. Like we talked about central factors, right? And this is where you're looking at truly dysfunctions in the brain, right? And I always tell my patients with traumatic brain injuries is it's kind of like your brain went from being a fuel efficient Prius getting 40 miles to the gallon to now maybe a gas guzzling truck getting 10 miles to the gallon, right? The brain's energy systems have just become less efficient. Okay. Once again, you can see these in things like MS, TBI, Parkinson's disease, strokes, dementia, all sorts of different things, right? Anything that really can affect the way the brain is working and the energy systems in the brain. Okay. Perfect. Looks like everyone but David is doing okay on hearing. So hopefully you can get that patched up and it will come through clear. So let's go a little bit more in depth like we were talking about. Okay. So homeostatic balance. Okay. So we're going to touch on each of these a little bit more in depth. Right. So this is disruption in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal stress axis. Big words. Just think of HPA stress axis. But pretty much this is the connection between your brain and your adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys. Okay. This is where you produce stress hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, glucocorticoids, right, or steroids, and all sorts of different neuroendocrine hormones. Okay. This is also the place where there are also regulation of blood sugar, regulation of sex hormones, body temperature. Individuals sometimes maybe with fatigue and they say, I'm cold all the time. Or maybe they say, I'm hot all the time, or I have difficulty with temperature regulation. That starts giving us a window into saying maybe there's alterations in their central energy regulator, right? So this is the part of the brain that is very much in control of regulating all energy throughout the body, right? So creates balance in energy systems, right? So this can be a huge driver of fatigue. And it's important for us to be able to identify this because the treatment for this is completely different than maybe, let's say, a fatigue coming from the muscular system, right? Or a fatigue coming from cortical networks. Two completely different things. Right? And there's different ways you can test for this, right? We can look at different blood work or saliva panels to look at hormone levels and how they're, and some of the signaling hormones coming from that hypothalamus. Okay. Psychological, like we talked about, right? Largely, this is alterations in frontal lobe networks. Okay. So your frontal lobe is the front of your brain. It's your executive brain. It's what separates us from primates, right? It's what makes humans humans. Okay. So within the frontal lobe, we have the prefrontal cortex, we have what's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the orbital frontal cortex, right? And all of these play a different role. Really, when you look at the prefrontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, those are your executive brain, right? Those are what make a business executive a business executive. They have everything to do with motivation, goal planning, rewards, taking goals and turning them into habits, right? And then the medial prefrontal cortex and the orbital frontal have a lot more to do with emotional regulation, with fear, with anxiety, with not saying things that are inappropriate, right? So maybe that, older gentleman in the nursing home who's saying things or doing things he shouldn't be doing, there's probably something going on with that orbital frontal cortex, right? Or maybe that person has no filter. And the things they say, you just say, wait, what are you saying? Right? Alterations in that orbital frontal cortex. Okay. So anytime there's alterations in this, right, that can affect mood. It can cause depression, can affect motivation, right, which can all give you the perception of fatigue. Okay. So like I said, fatigue related to mood disorders, depression, motivation, and reward issues. Okay. Peripheral fatigue, like we talked about, right? So there could be issues in the muscle nerves. And when I say glycogen, that's just the storage of energy in the form of carbohydrates, right? So maybe there's alterations in how the muscle can utilize different types of fuel, okay? Loss of muscle for secondary to energy depletion. There could be alterations or issues in the mitochondria, right? And the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cells. So there could be some alterations in the energy systems within the muscle, okay? Or there could also be alterations in creatine levels within the muscle as well. So creatine plays a huge role in muscle function, okay? There are certain muscle diseases and nerve pathologies like we talked about, things like Lambert-Eaton syndrome, MS, myasthenia gravis, things like ALS, right? These are a little bit more extreme things. So I don't want people to think like, hey, I got leg weakness or fatigue in my body, I have ALS. That's not what I'm saying at all. These are kind of the extremes. When those systems really go wrong, these are the types of pathologies we see. But there can be a little bit more benign things that are going on, right? Once again, really important because how we may treat Peripheral fatigue or muscular fatigue can be very different from homeostatic fatigue, or once again, is very different from executive function fatigue, right? Alterations in one's frontal lobe, okay? So once again, something we need to be able to identify and tease out with an appropriate workout examination and lab work, okay? And then the last one before we get into some other topics with fatigue is central fatigue, okay? This is alteration in brain networks, okay? The big point I want to make on this one, and that I see more often than not with patients with fatigue, is there's alterations in lower down reflexes within the brain. So when you think about the brain, I want you to think about different hierarchies, okay? So let's say you have subcortical and you have cortical networks. Think of subcortical networks as kids doing chores, right? They should be reflexive, and the cortical area, which are the parents, shouldn't have to think about it at all, right? Taking out the trash, mowing the lawn, doing the dishes, all of these different things, right, should be subcortical, right? They should be done on a daily basis. Examples of that are balance, visual processing, tracking objects, inner ear function, where am I in space, right? These are all subcortical reflexes that your brain really shouldn't have to worry about, okay? And then your cortex, right, is your parents, right? They're the ones paying the bills, doing the hard work, making sure food's on the table and everything's running, right? But if all of a sudden the garbage isn't getting taken out or the lawn's not getting mowed, right now the cortex of the brain has to do that on top of their already existing job, which leaves less time for other things, right? And things like balance, things like visual perception, things like knowing where you are in space are more important than understanding maybe what task you were trying to do, right? So this is really important because individuals with dizziness, visual processing issues, TBIs, they all have issues in sensory processing. And the fatigue comes from the executive areas of their brain wasting all of their energy trying to sort out those mismatches. So if you can fix one's sensory processing issues, their fatigue a lot of times disappears, right? Because it was never an issue in energy, it was an issue in inefficiency within the brain, right? So central fatigue, I want you to think about the brain is inefficient in working, right? And you need to rewire it or retrain it to become inefficient, right? And that's what we do is we find all the inefficiencies in different brain networks that we can measure, and then we do specific rehab to make those areas more efficient, which then frees up far more energy in the rest of the brain, right? This central fatigue is probably what I see. The central fatigue and the hypothalamic or homeostatic are probably the most common that I see clinically, right? The other ones you see, but they're just not quite as common. And individuals with brain injuries tend to fall more into this central fatigue category, okay? Next thing we're going to talk about, I know this slide has major depressive disorder. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about how do things like the immune system cause fatigue. So we talked about 4 different types of fatigue, right? So we talked about homeostatic balance, so alterations in the brain's ability to control energy in the body. Alterations maybe in energy within the muscles, right? Or the nerves, or alterations in central structures within the brain that regulate perception, mood, right? And then things like sensory processing, okay? Well, I'm going to make or kind of bring up a point of how can inflammation or how can things like infections or alterations in the immune system also cause fatigue. So there's an interesting research paper that came out probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was a paper in the frontier of neuroscience discussing the idea of depression as an inflammatory condition, right? And what they were looking at is that if you think about it, when we get the flu, right, or we get sick, right, the last thing you want to do is socialize with individuals. You become reclusive. You want to be in silent room, right? You withdraw, right? And there's some theories that there's an evolutionary process going on there, that when we have a fever, when our immune system senses a threat, that it alters neurochemicals in our brains and circuits to move us or cause us to become reclusive, right? Because we don't want to spread the infection and kill the tribe, right? So it's an interesting theory of looking at, depression and the immune state and different infections, and how there could be in the past, an evolutionary beneficial point that inflammation could cause things like depression, right? What we now know as depression, but maybe more neuroinflammation causing alterations in neurochemicals, causing one to recluse from society. Okay. So we're going to start getting into how the immune system can alter the way neurochemicals work, which can lead to things like fatigue, right? And this is a really cool picture here where you can see, so when you look at the chiarine pathway, it's a pathway that has to do with serotonin metabolism and tryptophan metabolism, and can lead to something called quinolinic acid, which is an inflammatory. So pretty much when you have inflammation, tryptophan, which is your precursor to serotonin, gets turned into quinolinic acid, which is highly inflammatory and highly neurotoxic. So this is why instead of creating serotonin, which is a feel-good hormone, you create a neurotoxin, right? And this is some of the theories behind depression as an inflammatory condition, okay? And then you can see, once again, that neuroendocrine axis, right? This glucocorticoids or the steroids, how those affect the brain, right? And then how things in the peripheral immune system, right? So within the body, joints, maybe your stomach, maybe your heart, how those affect the brain, okay? So this next slide is going to be really cool. It's really kind of busy, but I think it explains it really, really well. So if we look at the left, in bottom left in the red thing, so we have maybe autoimmune disorders, cancer therapies, cytokine immunotherapies, microbial infections, psychological stress, right? Something that causes inflammation. So we can see now we go up. Now we have systemic inflammation. So let's use COVID, for example. Some sort of infection causes systemic inflammation, right? This causes peripheral inflammatory mediators. So when we say peripheral, we just think outside the brain, not in the brain. Everywhere else in the body, but the brain, okay? Inflammatory mediators, okay? What's really interesting is you can see different pathways. So you have this first one that goes immune to brain communication. So these are able to signal via things like the vagus nerve up to the brain to say something is not right, right? Think of the brain as kind of like the panic room, and the rest of the body is the rest of the house. And it's getting signals to the panic room saying, hey, someone is breaking in. Things are not good out in the house, okay? If we go over to the left, you can see the IDO, right? And some of these other markers. And you don't need to worry about, the abbreviations, things like that. These are pretty much showing that these inflammatory chemicals can alter the productions of neurotransmitter. Or to say it differently is, neurotransmitters are made up of building block amino acids. Things like tryptophan, phenylalanine, all of these different, methionine, all these different amino acids or proteins are precursors to things like serotonin, dopamine, GABA, glutamate, all these different things, right? And what we see is that inflammation within the body can cause a decreased amount of neurotransmitter precursors to get to the brain. So pretty much, if you need phenylalanine and tryptophan to create serotonin and dopamine to make you feel good and be motivated, if you have inflammation, what happens is you decrease the availability of those precursors. So now you make less dopamine. Now you make less serotonin in the brain. Now you're sad. Now you're depressed. You feel less motivated, or you're fatigued. Okay. Right. So really interesting picture to see how these things that can start in the body, simple as the flu, COVID, an infection, whatever it may be, and how they can affect the immune system in the brain. Okay. And if we look to the right, you can see direct brain trauma. So TBIs, neurodegeneration, strokes, neuroinflammation, those things can directly also affect the brain's immune system, right? So you can see neurotoxicity, impaired neuronal environment, oxidative stress, right? Once again, impairing signal transduction between different areas, right? And ultimately, these lead to fatigue, sickness, depression, and cognitive impairment, right? So really, really cool picture that I think really sums it up to show that we have so many different things that can cause fatigue. So when one says they have fatigue and a doctor just writes it off, or they just put them on Adderall, or they just, give some arbitrary treatment, you can see it's so complex. And for each patient, we really have to understand, where do they fit into these categories, right? Is there an autoimmune condition? Is there a microbial infection? Is there psychological stress? Are they obese? Do they have blood sugar issues? Are there thyroid issues? Do they have an anemia, right? And that's what we do, is we really look at as many factors as we know that can affect the brain and affect fatigue. Because ultimately, fatigue is really a neurological condition for the most part, okay? Once again, another cool picture I thought, where you can see positive aspects of neuroinflammation. So I want us to not forget that neuroinflammation can be beneficial. It helps us to heal, right? But you can have negative aspects of neuroinflammation. So traumatic CNS injury, transient inflammation, right, leading to anxiety and depression, chronic constant low-grade inflammation from aging or TBIs, leading to cognitive impairment and reduced plasticity. And then chronic high inflammatory disorders, leading to things like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or neurodegenerative disorders, right? So inflammation isn't always bad. It's just when inflammation is not kept at bay or is in excess, okay? So really, to kind of summarize it up, when we look at inflammation, we want to think about a few different things that can drive that pathway. Three big things: DAMPs, PAMPs, and HAMPs, okay? DAMPs stand for damaged associated molecular patterns, right? Or damaged tissue. So an example of this is, you sprain your ankle and you damage tissue in your ankle. What your immune system does is it surveys this system, it takes a little bit of damaged tissue, and it presents it to the immune system in the lymph tissue, okay? And then this is where then you kind of send out a cleanup crew. The problem is, when you have excessive damage to any tissue, you run the risk of getting too much immune activation and inflammation, okay? And then you have things called PAMPs, or pathogen-associated molecular patterns, okay? Going back to COVID or different infections have different molecular patterns. And when the immune system recognizes that, it causes inflammation. And then HAMs, or what are called homeostatic alterating molecular processes. Once again, anything that alters homeostasis, alterations in electrolytes, alterations in blood sugar, right? Going back to that hypothalamus, anything that measures alterations in balance within the body can cause inflammation. So this is why we look at so many different things to see, how can all of these things be driving inflammation in one's fatigue, okay? So to kind of summarize, like we talked about, the goals would be to reduce neuroinflammation, reduce things like excitotoxicity, whereas the brain's kind of short-circuiting. And then right here, you can see these are kind of some big words, but reduce T cell and monocyte migration from the periphery. So reduce the amount of signaling coming from the immune system in the periphery to the brain, right? So that we can reduce the development of brain autoimmunity, right? And balance immune cells within the brain to limit brain inflammation and to limit brain fatigue, okay? Here are kind of some examples that I took from another presentation I did. Once again, this isn't how you fix fatigue, but this is how you can fix or improve inflammation in the brain, which secondarily could improve fatigue, right? So inflammation, we first need to fix sources of inflammation within the body: diabetes, heart disease, thyroid issues, anemias, right? All these things that can cause inflammation in the body, okay? This is where things like curcumin and resveratrol can be really helpful, because they're STAT3 and NFkappab inhibitors, right? So those are transcription factors in the immune system that signal inflammation. Things like vitamin D and vitamin A status are really, really important for inflammation as well. And then we have what's called the inflammasome. And this is actually really important when it comes to COVID, because part of the reason people are getting very sick is excessive inflammasome activation, or what's called the NLRP3 inflammasome, right? And that is just pretty much it. The inflammasome is a signaling system to create more inflammation, okay? Things that are beneficial for that are NAD precursors. So these are things like NMN or nicotinamide riboside. Some of you may be familiar with those. Some of you may have no clue what I'm talking about. It's kind of like the darling new drug of the anti-aging world, okay? Things like quercetin and things like resveratrol, right? And then this is where fasting and ketosis can be really helpful in calming down inflammation via calming down the inflammasome. Okay. And then we want to balance the immune cells within the brain. And this is where we can do things to increase what's called AMPK, right? Which we can do with berberine, metformin for those who are diabetic on the medication, or fasting, right? So AMPK is an enzyme that can really help with immune regulation. It can really help um, with inflammation, right? And AMPK is a problem in diabetes, right? And that's why individuals get put on metformin, because metformin helps to modulate AMPK activation. But a natural way that's been shown to be almost nearly as effective is something called berberine, okay? And then we want to do things with different types of antioxidants, right, to balance those immune systems out, okay? And then, like we talked about, we want to decrease the excitotoxicity within the brain, right? This is where things like magnesium can be helpful. These are where things like glutathione or alpha lipoic acid or N-acetylcysteine can be helpful, is that when the immune system gets ramped up in the brain, it causes the brain to become overexcited. And as it becomes overexcited, think of it like a car that you're revving at like 7,000 RPMs. Eventually, it's going to break down and it's going to die, right? So if a neuron is firing at 7,000 RPMs for days on end, they're eventually going to die. So we need to settle down the secondary excitotoxicity, right? And that's where things like I said, magnesium glycinate, things like glutathione, alpha lipoic acid, and N-acetylcysteine can play a role. Okay. And once again, these are more specifically for if the fatigue may be more related to neuroinflammation. Okay. So to kind of wrap it up or to summarize, the big things are that there is hope, right? So many individuals suffer from fatigue and so many go with so few answers, right? And what we really try to do is search to really see if we can find the root. Now, once again, you can't always find what maybe started it, but can we categorize the type of fatigue, right? Because the better we can categorize one's symptoms, the better we know if treatment is going to be successful and what treatment to choose, right? Because things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy may be only effective for people with a certain type of fatigue, right? Vestibular rehab or vision therapy is going to be really helpful for someone with fatigue central from sensory processing, but it's not going to do anything to someone who's got hypothalamic issues, right? Or maybe even brain inflammation issues. If someone has brain inflammation, you got to find out where the inflammation is coming from. And if you treat that, then their fatigue gets better, right? So really important that you find a clinician or a clinic that really specializes this and understands the complexity of it, right? And what I want to really leave you with is to act sooner rather than later. And then also the fact that it's never too late. So many individuals think it's too late. They've been dealing with issues for years, and it's not, right? There's always something that can be done. And then the last thing is that we offer free consultations, right? So a lot of people may be saying, well, how do I know you can help me? And I say, I don't know if I can, right? That's the reason I offer free 30-minute consultations, to get to know your case and to see, do I think we'd be a good fit, or give me the opportunity to be able to send you to a really good clinic or doctor that I think would be perfect for your care, right? So that's something that I really like offering, because I realize that people have spent so much money and time going to a million doctors that I want to make sure we're a good fit, or that I can recommend you to an appropriate doctor or clinic, okay? So if you live in the Denver area, we are on KLZ The Source or Haystack Radio every Monday. Myself, Dr. Stedman, or Jacob, we rotate through and we talk about a lot of these topics. So if you want to listen to us more and learn more about our clinic, you can find us there. During this lovely COVID epidemic, we are offering telehealth, right? So a lot can still be done via telehealth. So a lot of individuals don't feel comfortable traveling, and I totally understand. And once again, if you have really bad fatigue that's secondary to neuroinflammation, you probably should be careful, right? Because you don't want COVID, because that can make those things a lot worse. Okay, so telehealth is still available. You can do a lot of treatment via telehealth, still order blood work, right? And still really look at a lot of things. Okay. And yeah, so like I said, we're integrated health systems and integrated brain centers. That is our number. So if you're interested in learning more of our clinic, or you're interested in setting up a consultation for your loved one that may be suffering from fatigue, and you want to learn more to see what we have to offer, if we might be able to help, please feel free to call and just ask, and they can get you a call set up with myself, Dr. Perry Maynard. Um, I want to thank everyone so much for joining. I will kind of finish up or wrap up and give individuals an opportunity to ask any questions they have. And then once we're done with questions, everyone is good to go for the night. So fire away with any questions in the chat box if you have them. All right. Well, if there are no questions, once again, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I hope you have a great evening. I hope everyone stays healthy and safe during these times. And I look forward to seeing you guys in a few weeks for another webinar. So, once again, if you have any questions or you want to learn more, just give us a call at 303 781 5617. And like I said, we're doing these webinars weekly on various topics. So if there's a topic you want to hear, call the office, let them know. And we'll see if we can put something together. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great evening.